Okay, so let me just start that. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this month's what we call now the F word for fraud topics. For those who don't know me, I'm the co-founder and managing director of Maisie. My background is working in digital forensics and e-crime investigations for about 15 years, and co-founded Maisie because I had enough of dealing with the aftermath of fraud and wanted to build a tool that was proactive in preventing it. And during my career, I had the pleasure of working with James McDowell. So we have worked on investigations together, and James joins us from Decode Cyber Forensics and investigations firm. And I'm just going to pass the mic over to James to give an introduction, if you wouldn't mind, James, just a little bit about who you are, where you've come from, and what you guys do at Decode.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. So yes, my name is James McDowell. I've been in cybersecurity for about 14 years now, starting with I had a business that did high-level government security assessments, so really assessing data at top secret and above. In the last 10 years, I've focused much more on incident response, forensics, and investigations. Earlier this year, I launched a new business, my own business, called Decode Forensics, and we really work alongside partners, law firms, some accountancy firms in some insolvency cases, where we forensically collect evidence to support what the lawyer or the accountant is trying to prove or disprove.
Great. Thank you, James. Thanks. So the session today is going to look at how accountants can best support their clients in the aftermath of fraud. But just to frame the issue, there's some alarming government statistics around the growth of fraud. The latest number, I think, is just under 25% growth in reported fraud cases from 2022 to 2024. And from my understanding, there's lots of driving factors around what's growing that rise in small business fraud and why they're being targeted. But James, can you just give us a definition from your side in what are the most common ways that small businesses are being targeted by fraudsters?
Okay, just before I do that, I think it's important to understand why are small businesses
Mm,
targeted, and I think the preeminent kind of modus operandi of an attacker is what's the path of least resistance. And what they've started to find over the years is the security processes and the mechanisms and tooling that larger organizations have in place make it harder to get in. So what they're starting to go for is the lower hanging fruit. And now I don't want to cast aspersions that all small businesses have less mature security protocols in place, but it is proven to be the case. So that's why hackers have started to look at smaller businesses. And there are a plethora of ways that they attack smaller businesses, but the key ones we see coming up a lot are business email compromise. So, business email compromise is where an attacker gains access to either the email address of
oh, I can't hear you, James. Can you hear me? Oh, I lost you, James. Sorry there. You still
oh,
there?
yes, I'm still there. Sorry.
Cool.
Yes, I was just saying that the business email compromise is where an attacker will impersonate, either by email or some other form, um, a, a senior member of the team, CEO or CFO.
Yeah.
They may well sit and monitor emails for weeks, months to understand some personal details about the person, what their family do, where they went on holiday. And that helps them to add credibility, because what they will do is they will jump into that email train,
Mhm.
perhaps with a vendor, and say, oh, actually, can you pay this invoice? Or to a client, can you pay this invoice? I hope your kids are okay, etc., etc. So what they'll do is they'll effectively funnel funds into an account. So that's one we see a lot of. Phishing remains one of the biggest ways that people are attacked. So sending an email to a member of staff with a link in it, they click on their link and they provide their credentials. That's often a popular mechanism because once you've got the credentials, obviously you can naturally circumvent any of the security controls that a company might have in place. And the third one we see a lot of is invoice fraud. You may or not be aware of the one that's happened recently, which is the chap based in Latvia who managed to, I think he purloined about $100 million out of Google and Facebook, and it really was the hack was sophisticated, the principle wasn't. He created a company in Latvia, I think it was called Quanta. Quanta were actually a Taiwanese hardware supplier to Facebook and to Google, and he started sending them invoices, which were all paid. And that totaled about $100 million. The final piece, and it's the one that a lot of companies don't necessarily focus on. They tend to be focused on the threats that come from outside of an organization. But what we're starting to see is a lot more insider threats. An insider threat is really people within the organization enacting fraud. Now, they are in a privileged position because they might have ready access to finance systems, to HR records, all kinds of sensitive company information. So they're in a privileged position. So we're seeing a lot more of that coming. But those four tend to be the main ones. We were involved in a case in the summer, actually, and an IT director, we'd been the IT director at a company for 10 years or more. It was discovered, and actually it was discovered because his wife caught him having an affair. So he told the CEO of the company that the IT director had been falsifying invoices for the last 5 or 6 years. And what he was doing was he was going to a supplier and saying, how much is this going to cost? It's 20,000, fine. Send me an invoice for 30,000. I'll get it paid and we'll split the 10. That is becoming much more common. So focusing not just on the outside or external threat, but the inside threat is important as well.
We've seen that a lot, especially with small companies, James, where there's a level of trust with team members, and none of us like to think that someone we've worked with for 10 years is going to dupe us out of money. But the sad fact is that there's very little demarcation of responsibility. That IT director is the procuring the equipment and paying the supplier, and pushing it through the financial process. What do you think is the motivation for that individual, and are there any telltale signs that you can spot that person is up to no good?
It's a really good question. And I think we try and advise people to look at it a slightly different way. Trying to understand what is in people's minds is extremely difficult. So, in lieu of that, we always encourage people to have the right controls in place that help to protect that. So, and that involves things like considering what level of access someone has within a business, i.e., that they are only given access to things they absolutely need to. Now, in the case we were just talking about in the IT director, should he have been responsible for paying the invoice, or should there have been a secondary person, the CFO, that signs that off? And perhaps steps put in place to validate the invoice itself. Because no matter how much we try, and we all want to trust our employees, it's very difficult to understand who's the bag egg and who isn't. So we really need to think about the controls we have in place to mitigate the risk.
Yeah. Talking about tooling and having controls from a client perspective, obviously there's great tools out there and processes you could put in place. But what we've seen from a hacker and perpetrator perspective now is the adoption of AI and advanced tools from the hacker side, from the perpetrator side. And I've had a little play around and I look at, we're all familiar with Chat GPT, and there's now Fraud GPT, which essentially enables you to create fake phishing emails from banks, create fake websites, all automated using AI to create this. I think it's about $200 a month, found on the dark web. So the availability of tools for hackers and criminals seems to be getting more and more advanced. What's your experience there, James? What have you seen?
You're absolutely right. In some ways, it is a. We talk about AI and how it benefits us as businesses, how it makes processes more efficient. But what we don't always talk about is actually those tools are not the preserve of the good guys. Actually, the bad guys have them, and they actually have the time and investment and wherewithal to actually develop them much more quickly. A couple of examples of where AI has really helped attackers. Back to my point before, they're looking for path of least resistance. And what they're starting to see is that they're coming up against stronger security infrastructure within businesses. So what they need to do is be able to increase, number one, the sophistication of what they're doing, and number two, the scale of what they're doing. So in terms of sophistication, long gone are the days where people are falling for the Nigerian prince that's left you $35 million. But actually, a lot of the phishing emails that we're seeing now are very, very, very well done. And they're done by AI. There was an interview with the head of security at Lloyds Bank probably about 6 months ago, and he said, I nearly fell for one because of how good it is. So what it's providing, the AI is providing credibility. What it's also doing is it can scrape data from all kinds of sources, especially social media. And what that allows it to do is understand what are the triggers for Oliver Crofton, what would make Oliver Crofton click on that link, and they're developing much more bespoke approaches. The final piece is the scale. They know that if they're getting a 1% hit rate, they need to increase the volume, and AI enables them to do that at very, very low cost.
Yeah, that's yeah. I think we forget that as the good side as consumers of these new tools, that they're not just the providers of us. You know, the criminals have got access to these and have the time to invest in using them properly for maximum effect. Many people on this call will be clients of Maisie, so hopefully this won't be an issue, or at least reduces the chance of being an issue. But let's say a fraud has happened, and the accountant gets a phone call, usually on a Friday evening at 5 p.m., to say, "Look, something's gone wrong. We've just discovered these payments." What in the immediate aftermath are the important things for those professional advisors to do around their clients? How can they support their clients in that first golden 24-hour period?
Okay, so the one thing that we always say to clients is it's speed of response. Okay, the quicker that you can respond to an incident, the better. There is evidence out there when you look at, if you analysis of lots of different breaches, that there is a direct correlation between impact on the business and speed of response. The quicker you respond, the lower the impact. So particularly in certain types of fraud, I think the accountancy firm can be super helpful, right? Especially when it's business email compromise, to actually help understand, whether there were any, what data do they have around a particular fraud? So invoice was paid to X vendor. What do we know about that vendor? The aftermath is what people do tend to focus on. But I have to say, our experience tells us that the most important bit is not the aftermath, it's beforehand, right? If you imagine a breach or any kind of security incident, you have a jigsaw puzzle in front of you. Now, the more pieces of that jigsaw puzzle you have in the right place from the outset, the much easier it is for companies like us. Because if we go in and we've got half the jigsaw there, and by that, those pieces are created by having access to log data, having access to, audit files, anything that you've got that is already pre-prepared and that we can just have access to it. The fewer the pieces we've got, the more it's like a needle in a haystack approach. So we often talk with accountants about, well, if this does happen, how quickly can we get access to your log data? And more often than not, these things are dragged out. And a big part for us in terms of evidence is logs from emails, from security tooling. Now, like CCTV cameras, that data is overwritten probably every 30 days. You can change it to make it longer, but let's say not often people do that. So they'll come to us after about 6 weeks and say, hey, we think something's gone wrong. Can you help us? We've lost all of that data. So that fast response is a really important part of it. And what part of that information would a lawyer have? An accountant have? Those bits are the ones we want to see. And actually tooling like Maisie is super useful for us because it does give us somewhere to start. What did it say? We know that these things can happen. So having access to all of the possible data sources we can get help us to build that picture much more quickly.
That's helpful. We've worked on many cases together, James, where you get that call on the Friday and you have to jump in to support the client. It's quite an emotional time for them. And there's a lot of people that are generally brought onto a call that they don't necessarily know. So quite often there'll be a lawyer on the call. There'll be obviously digital forensics like Decode. There'll be potentially insurance company, maybe potentially communications. Certainly for the bigger companies. The accountant in this in this scenario is probably one of the few professional advisors that has had a longer term relationship with that client. What can they do from a client relationship perspective, and how do they? Is there have you seen this play out before where there's a account management structure or process that they should follow with clients when things go wrong?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, that team of people who are involved at the beginning, it's super important to identify who are they and what do I need from you when this happens. Now, where the accountant comes in is any breach has an impact, right? And every impact is measured in financial cost. Now, I believe that the accountant's real value is in that upfront piece, right? So often you might have boards that go, well, we've never been breached. It's never going to happen to us. We hear that all the time. It's never going to happen to us. So you have to try and raise the awareness within organizations and add value at that earlier stage by saying to a business, hey guys, if a ransomware attack happened or if a business email compromise happened, this is what we see as the final impact, financial impact to you, okay? So enabling them to position the fraud in a context of financial impact is a really good way to get engagement and add value to clients because they don't have time to this. They don't necessarily think of it in terms of financial impact. And that communication piece is also really, really important. Having the facts at your disposal. I'm sure that you all remember probably the original biggest hack that we all know about, and that was TalkTalk. And actually, the problem with the TalkTalk breach was not the breach itself, it was the way it was communicated. Dido Harding came out and she said, we've lost 150 gigabytes of data, and it includes customer information. That actually wasn't true. She was armed with piecemeal information. And actually, the breach was much, much, much smaller than that. But by that time, it was too late. So making sure in those early phases, whatever data points that an accountant can provide from a financial perspective is really important to get those out quickly.
That's interesting. I like that way that you're saying about supporting clients understand what that risk looks like in a financial terms, because I think we talk a lot about the importance of email security, the importance of good governance around IT security, and being aware of fraud. But not very often is there a figure actually put on what a fraud might look like in terms of financial loss or impact to the business. I did read a stat the other day that said companies that have lost data, 70% of companies that have lost data are out of business within 3 years after
Yeah,
that breach.
yeah.
What's your experience in terms um, of impact in following a breach and a fraud within an organization? How does that recovery process start, and what do businesses do afterwards?
It really, really depends on what type of breach it is. And this is super important. This is why we bang the drum of that preparation piece, because something like business email compromise, we were involved in one together, Oliver, if you remember. And an invoice was paid to the value of £3 million.
Mm.
You are never seeing that money back. The sophistication of where that money goes once it's left the business, you would probably spend £3 million trying to find it. So, we kind of advise clients is, it's you're shutting the stable door once the horse is bolted with business email compromise. So making sure you've got the processes in place before that happens is really important, because we're not going to get it back. In terms of other types of breaches where a vulnerability was exploited within a network, or a member of staff has clicked on a link and they've downloaded malware. Again, with those kind of breaches, those can and are remediated. And during those first kind of few hours of a breach, it's chaos, which is why it's important to have a structured response plan in place. Who's going to be involved? What kind of information do I need from you? And then to act quickly to isolate the systems that you believe are affected. Okay, that's the most important way. And you've got everyone's attention at that point.
Mm.
What we go on.
I was just going to say, what does that team look like? Okay, so we've got accountants on the call now. They want to say, right, okay, I want to be prepared if my client calls me and they've discovered that there's been payments that they shouldn't have made. In the round, what type of people need to be in that team to respond? And I appreciate
Okay.
it depends on, maybe it depends on the value and lots of different factors, but in general, who should be on your emergency call list?
Okay, so a lot of people believe that it's all IT's problem. Okay, it's not IT's problem. The senior management, the CEO, they are the ones responsible for defining a security strategy. The IT team are responsible for enacting the security strategy. So the CEO, the decision makers, they must be there, and IT must be there. Now, clearly, it depends on the type of business you are, but certainly you should have legal counsel there. And again, back to our point about the financial impact, the CFO or accountancy firm or whoever it might be that can support that. So those are a minimum. Larger businesses will also have a PR or crisis comms firm involved. Sometimes it's HR. I mean, we did run a tabletop exercise doing exactly this. So a tabletop exercise is you go into a business and you pretend a breach has happened. And we had the head of HR in, and after about 10 minutes, this is nothing to do with me, and effectively walked out of the room. So we created a scenario where all the HR systems had been breached, and the ICO you were looking at a fine of millions of pounds. So, you've got to make people understand why they're there, not just, we want you to drag it in. And it's finding that balance between having a tight enough group of people that you can move with agility and speed, but having enough of the right expertise and resource at your disposal. So finding that balance again comes in that preparation piece.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You touched on the case that a case that we did together around the 3 million loss, which was from memory was a series of smaller invoices that were paid over a 18-month period, and it was quite a high-profile organisation. Certainly could be defined as critical national infrastructure by the UK government, yet there was no government law enforcement applied or given to us during that investigation, even though we tried to engage police. What's your experience about law enforcement support? Because you've not really mentioned that, especially in the team of who you would bring in together. What's your experience with getting the law on your side to support you, or is that a non-starter?
It's
What do you see?
it's a super difficult one. We actually think that people are they're more concerned about the regulatory landscape rather than the law enforcement. And what are you engaging law enforcement for? Um, because the police just don't have the resources to independently investigate cybercrime, right? That's why there are businesses like us who are engaged. Um, unless, I mean, it would depend what the impact on the general public would be. That whether or not the scale at which law enforcement would be involved. But given what I said earlier about the chance of actually recovering those funds is so slim, the police understand that, and that's why they won't necessarily get involved at that level. I think the bigger piece is the regulatory landscape and engaging with people like the ICO. It's like anything, if you the ICO appreciate that people are going to get breached. The way you engage with them proactively goes a long, long way to helping your cause. So I would probably veer away from focusing on a law enforcement engagement and actually think about the regulatory authorities that you need to be conversing with.
Very interesting. Um, in terms of that investigation side, just to unpick one other point on that. When money has been paid and it's gone, what is your experience from recovering those funds? And are there's some talk around, well, there has been some legislation change where banks pay out payments, remuneration for any fraud that's happened is reducing in some instances. What's your experience where the money's been paid and success rates in getting it back?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? And actually, I think the government themselves have inadvertently told the public that there isn't much chance because the original threshold that the government proposed was 400,000. Now that's been reduced to 85. So what does that say to you? That says to you, well, we know this is going to happen. We know we're probably not going to get the money back. So we don't want necessarily the banks exposed at 400,000 per breach. And the, you know, as soon as those funds are converted into crypto, the chance of identifying them is so infinitesimally small. And the problem is not only is it small, the actual cost to engage a firm to undertake that, what could be a very, very long-term investigation, becomes prohibitive in itself. And that's why we keep going back to the point, try and mitigate the risk of it happening, because once that horse is bolted, I think, I would say in percentage terms, the chance of you recovering all of the funds is probably zero. The chance of you getting some of the funds is probably less than 5%.
It seems fairly profitable for fraudsters. I
Yes,
think we're on the
indeed.
wrong side of the fence, but anyway. um, I second that, and I think sometimes the motivation from the client as well is that they don't want the publicity, or it's the cost and even the publicity around the issue. There was a case that I was told about, I didn't work on it, where the finance company had lost £5 million, and the company didn't want to, and it was an insider threat, insider job, but the company didn't want to prosecute or follow it up with a further investigation because they didn't want the publicity around that money being taken out of the business over an extended period of time. So
That point you make on the reputational impact is a really important one, because our experience tells us that it's not the actual breach that impacts the reputation, it's the way the breach is handled, right? So those companies that come out very quickly and say, here's what's happened, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, but this is what we're going to do to fill in those gaps. And they communicate with people clearly and quickly. They notify authorities as they're supposed to. They manage that process very well. Actually, we've seen that companies don't suffer any reputational impact. It's when, in your case, Oliver, where they keep it hidden under the carpet and it unravels, because it will unravel at some point. That's where we see the reputational damage done.
Interesting. James, we're coming up to the end of our discussion, but we've got a few questions which I want to cover off that have come in, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A button to ask any questions that you may have. The first one that's come in just asks a question around insurance and what is your experience around payouts from insurance companies?
That is an absolute minefield. I think what's happened in the insurance space is that they started handing out policies without really understanding the risk. Okay, so because of the data that insurance companies have got a car, they will tell you what the risk of driving a yellow BMW 3 Series at 11 o'clock at night is because they've got the data. They didn't necessarily have that breach data, that level of detail. So they couldn't quantify the risk well, and they came unstuck. So they were handing out insurance policies and it was costing them millions and millions of dollars. So what happened was they then pared this back. And they've said, well, we're going to triple your premiums and we're going to give you half the cover. And now it's started to come back full circle. So, and the question of will they cover you or won't they cover you, it's very difficult to say. What I will say is that some of the larger insurers are being much more proactive about it. So I urge you to talk to your insurer and define a policy that suits. Get them to help you understand what they are covered for and what you are covered for and what you aren't covered for, and also what the insurer's expectations are, the kind of MOTs you need to be running on your business in order for that to pay out. But there are so many different types of insurance policies out there. Now with these big cyber teams, insurance firms, talk to them, work with them. They're being much more proactive, but it is a minefield, the cyber insurance space still. It is getting better, but it's still a minefield.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you've seen the insurance companies do a full circle, because I remember even 2 years ago when we were speaking with insurers, they just were pulling entirely back from any type of digital crime payouts, and even policies really taking that out because of the financial burden. I think it was a lot of it's to do with ransomware attacks that they miscalculated would be so prevalent.
Exactly. If you think a ransomware attack and they're suddenly asking for $5 million, and then you've got the cost of recovery, and then the loss of data, potential class action lawsuits, etc., etc., etc. I think when Maersk were hit by ransomware, that ended up costing them $350 million just in recovery and lost revenue. So it's a big ticket item for insurance companies now. And I think a lot of the providers have fallen away. And actually what you're left with is a core of insurers that actually really understand the business, and they'll help you tailor a solution for one that suits you.
Just got another question come in. It's around the US insurance market. They sort of mandate that you need to have a security operations center in order to get insurance now, which isn't really the proviso of small businesses. For an SME to certainly not to have an in-house SOC, but maybe SOC being security operations center, not having an in-house SOC. But are there any sort of mandated requirements that you see insurers require to protect against digital fraud? SOC being one in the US, but in the UK market, where there's a necessity to have certain levels of security or processes in place.
There will absolutely be, and that will be made clear in your. Let's go back to the analogy of the car. No one's going to insure me in a car if I haven't bothered to get it MOT'd for 3 years and I don't maintain it properly, and my headlights don't work, and all of those kind of things, right? The same applies to a cyber insurance policy, where there will be expectations that the company does what it can to protect its systems. But what everyone should understand is that no system is 100% secure. It is impossible for a system to be 100% secure. So there's always going to be an element of risk. But they want to show, the stigma of being breached is not what it was 5-10 years ago. People understand it happens. What they want to see is that the company is willing and able and trying to do what they can to mitigate that risk. And where that's the case, you'll find that you'll be supported by most of the authorities, insurance companies. The insurance market in the US is much, much different to the UK, I would add. The insurers really define that cyber market, and their objective is when someone gets breached, they want that business back up and running as quickly as possible. They don't care about necessarily the aftermath. How did it happen? Why did it happen? What are the lessons learned? And some drawn out investigation. They just want the business back up and running, and whatever that takes in as short a time as possible. Whereas in the UK, we find that lesson learned piece seems to be much more of interest, where CISOs or chief information security officers will be like, well, what went wrong and how can I stop that happening again? So they are different markets, but be under no illusion. If you take a cyber insurance policy, there will be expectations that you meet certain criteria.
James, I'm going to just bring us to a close, and I want just you to summarize for us, because we've covered a lot of ground in this session, and you've been really a great guest and really informative stuff. Even I've learned a lot from this session. Thank you. It sounds like, although the session is very much around how accountants can support their clients in the aftermath of a fraud, a lot of this is based on prevention and upfront activity that accountants can do with SMEs now. With the figures around fraud being about 1 in 3 SMEs affected by fraud every year, it's a problem that is going to become an issue for accountants, right? They're going to see it on a weekly basis. It's a growing issue. So, what are the top things that accountants can do to be proactive with clients? Just to summarize for us how. There is a conversation I have with businesses and partners that they say, well, I don't, is this my remit? Should I be involved in supporting our clients reduce their fraud risk? And inevitably, they're going to be involved anyway. If there is a breach or there is a payout, they're not going to escape it. They're going to have to support clients. So we work with those proactive firms that want to put measures in place up front. And obviously, from a software perspective, that's where we sit. But from a awareness, governance, process perspective, what are the top sort of 3 to 5 things that accountants can do for their clients to help reduce this happening in the first place?
So I think number one is the early alerting piece, right? So if accountants are undertaking any kind of financial audit work or anything on behalf of the client, do they see any anomalies? Are we expecting accountants to become cybersecurity expert? Absolutely not. But whatever anomalies or triggers that you can see, or that any kind of business like ours gets informed about, or a business gets informed about, the earlier you can spot that happening, the better. I talked earlier about dwell time. We know that a hacker doesn't come in, attack a business, and out he goes in a week. The chances are that hacker will have been in those systems for at least 2 to 3 months beforehand. Do we see any evidence of that in the audit work we do as accountants in terms of invoice, irregular payments, anything like that is super, super helpful to a business. And it's added value. It's not necessarily something that you're doing because you're going to make additional funds out of it. Through a longer term relationship with a client, adding that value is really important. Also helping business to understand, as I talked about, what's the impact, what's the financial impact. Senior management teams understand nothing more clearly than a financial impact. So helping to quantify that, can really help to drive the security agenda. Because, going back to your comment about the cyber insurance, if you're going to take cyber insurance, you're going to have certain controls in place. What controls, where do you spend the money? Well, we understand what the biggest financial impact is. Where is that risk? And that's where we invest our money. And that's how accountants can also help. So I think those are probably the key pieces. This all comes down to what is the financial impact on a business? And also, as an accountancy firm, having procedures in place that enable you to respond quickly. So when a client says, I've just had a business email compromise, you've got access to that client data quickly, easily, the relevant data you might need, access to tooling you might be running from that company, zero logs, whatever it might be. Having those readily accessible is super helpful.
Great. James, thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest on today. How can people reach out to you if they've got further questions? How do we contact you and bombard you
So
with
the
queries?
company is Decode Forensics and Investigations. You can visit the website. I'm James.McDowell at decodeforensics.com. More than happy. We don't, we very, very regularly provide pro bono advice and support to people who may, we always say, if you're unsure, ask. Don't wait until it's too late. So, if anyone needs advice or guidance or anything like that, we're more than happy to provide that.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. I will circulate a copy of the recording if you want to share with any colleagues. But thank you for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks very much, Oliver.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.